Alright, so, Hard West. Typically, I try and do a review, and the first thing that happens is I write a bunch of notes and they go, I never articulate them properly, so I might as well just do this all off the cuff. So, this is going to be a review for both Hard West, the main game, and also Scars of Freedom, the additional DLC. Because, as much as, and I will go into this, Scars of Freedom I think is a very good DLC, it's still using 99% of the core game mechanics that Hard West has. So there's no real sense of doing like two separate reviews, because if you've got the game, the DLC is just more of the game, so why wouldn't you want it? But anyway, so Hard West, it is a turn-based tactical shooter with choose your own story, choose your own adventure style elements, set in what is known as the Weird West, which is a subgenre, kind of alluding somewhere close to steampunk, biopunk, kind of eldritch horror type things. Some Lovecraftian themes quite commonly come up, as well as natural folklore, where you see a fusion of fantasy and kind of pulp, rip-roaring action. It is a genre I really enjoy. If you have the opportunity to read any of Sherry Priest's novels, Bone Shaker, The Inexplicables, lots and lots of very good novels in that kind of vein, based around somewhat weird mythological stuff, some science, some just actual turn of the century revolutionary stuff as well. So very, very interesting. So straight off the offset, I was pretty much queued up to really like Hard West. I always like going for games where I think they're going to show me something new, or they're going to touch on something I think doesn't get a lot of attention, and especially Weird West is something that I love, but gets very, very little attention. Ever since Undead Nightmare for Red Dead Redemption, I realised, oh no, I like this. I like this really dark, twisted perception of the American Old West, and it works fantastically well. So, from a thematic standpoint, Hard West isn't necessarily trying to reinvent the wheel, it's simply harnessing a world which is already there, and already has quite a big following, and is leveraging that in order to create what I thought was going to be a much bigger, broad-running campaign, and to an extent it is a longer, broad-running campaign, but its storytelling approach is actually done through the process of a lot of small vignettes. So rather than it just being the main story. I'm also going to apologise in advance. I'm terrible remembering character names, but when you're taking into context, this is Hard West, where you've got a cast of about 20 people, all of which get almost the exact same amount of screen time. It can get a bit difficult for keeping track of everything. I can remember Solomon Delia and The Undertaker, and that's pretty much it. And I think both those guys had like one or two stories apiece. So you can kind of tell, like, I have a hard time keeping up with everything. But you had two ways of doing this, and one was do one central kind of cast, extend it across the whole story, and just have this one big tale unfolding. Hard West decided not to go for that, and I think it was an interesting choice. It could have gone very badly. But what happened was, rather than trying to structure a very long campaign, you still tell a longer story, but you're doing it through the eyes and through the locales, kind of through the situations of multiple characters, all of which have some relation to the story. It's almost like a, not quite Rashomon, because that was more the same event being retold from different perspectives, but this is very much like a shandified narrative, and you've got different people who have taken effect at different points along the main storyline, having their own mini stories, kind of tangentially branching off from it or folding back into the main story. And it works. It actually makes sense. At no time did I ever think, oh, this is kind of pointless. Because you're getting origin stories for antagonists, you're getting the aftermath of what previous campaigns did and how they go wrong or how they go right. You have this whole world being built through mini campaigns. And I think if you're ever going to do that, if you're ever going to break down a longer campaign into shorter missions that may not be always directly related, this is how you do it. You take into consideration how the world has been changed since the last campaign, and how this new campaign may interact with it or may bounce off of it. So, in regards to narrative, in regards to the way it's structured, that's really, really, really good. I really enjoyed that. Now, moving on from the way it's structured, the way it actually is, the actual story itself, it's good. I enjoyed it. It's got a very distinct flavour of pulp, slightly cheesy fiction in there, in that it is a lot of packs of demons, inscrutable bad guys, twisted anti-heroes, like curses, all this dark, horrible, horrible stuff. I may have laughed at stuff that I think wasn't intended to be funny, and perhaps the game could have benefited from maybe not taking itself quite so seriously, but at the same time, it was a very enjoyable but not too heavyweight drama. Like, there are some elements of tragic deaths and reunions and people discovering their gifts and whether or not they want to keep it or get rid of it, especially in Scars of Freedom, which I think probably does touch on the heaviest themes with slavery. It doesn't go into like a tremendous level of richness in it, kind of engaging with racism in the era, engaging with bias and the use of the African American people by rich landowners and the whole fucking eugenics bullshit and things like that could have been brought up but wasn't. I can't exactly give Hard West a hard time for not tackling difficult and awkward themes. It's like, you're one of the very few games who's even bothered to make a Weird West game. I'm not going to have a go at you because you're not turning this into a dissertation on the rights of man. You're not Martin fucking Luther with a shotgun. Although if that wants to be a DLC, I'm totally down. I'm totally on board for that. So, the story is fine, it works, it's entertaining. At no point did I feel like I was going through a campaign and going, okay, I don't really give a shit about this. Everything had a point, had a purpose, and while the dialogue may not exactly been like whip-cracking, like really pin-sharp, it was described on a broader scale, and it all worked nice. The narration by Death, the only real voice actor until you got to Scars of Freedom, was absolutely fine, and I liked having Death as like this narrator who is entirely removed from the plot. Like, even when Satan is appearing and all these demons and undead and things, so like, Death is just the guy in the background cleaning up the mess afterwards. He is totally impartial, and I like that. You could have done maybe something with like unreliable narrators and you're seeing things through their eyes as you go through each campaign, like the Inquisitor. After Solomon Delir's mission, you've then got the Inquisitor who is undoing all the good work that was done and ends up raising, sorry, spoilers if you're listening to the review, by the way, this review contains spoilers if you hadn't found that out yet. Well, tough shit, motherfucker. It might have been interesting just to see how his perspective of how things were going on may have shifted and twisted and eventually manifested in something much worse near the end. But this is something where this is just me going, I would have liked to have seen this, but what was there was still perfectly adequate, if not good. So, yeah, overall, in terms of the story, in terms of the entire narrative, the way the narrative was executed, I could have had more, I would have liked more, but what I had was absolutely great, and I would not say, like, get rid of any of that. It was like, no, this all worked perfectly fine. So, moving on from story, tone, art style, execution, all worked out pretty well. Naturally, this is not a very high-funded game. It was kickstarted. I mean, John Romero and a bunch of other guys got on board backing this, so that was fantastic, and it's so really nice that this is a Kickstarter project that really came good and delivered on its promises. But at the same time, you could kind of tell there were certain, like, maybe the graphics could have been a bit sharper, the artwork could have been a bit nicer. I mean, it was all kind of thematically consistent at the very least. You had a certain tone you aimed for with the art style, and you just kept with it. And again, it's one of those things where it's functional. The music was good. Again, the music was unobtrusive but entertaining when you did pay attention to it. But there were no big, like, I have no compunction to sit down and listen to the soundtrack. Only a very few games have ever made me do that. One is Doom, one is Red Dead Redemption. So, like, you've got a high bar set there for, like, you've got to really try to make me give a shit. But aside from that, I mean, again, very serviceable, didn't make my eyes bleed, and at the end of the day, worked pretty much fine. So yes, now we come to the meat of it, which is the gameplay, the guts of it, the actual body of the review, and this has been something where I've had a bit of an issue. I have not been a fan of turn-based shooters, turn-based strategy games, that kind of thing. One, I don't tend to have the forethought, and two, I really don't like the RNG aspect of it. I find a lot of the time, I try and do something, and then I get fucked. And I think that's really unfair. That's the reason why I really prefer more free-form narrative tabletop games, opposed to the really crunchy ones, because I know I can leverage my way out of a situation by thinking outside the box, whereas in a game, very often you're left with a few very distinct options, and if none of those are particularly good, you're fucked, which I think is kind of unfair. So, how did Hard West handle this? Well, for the most part, it was still sticking to the same basic ideas. It's turn-based, you comprise a small squad of people, you outfit them with weapons, you outfit them with abilities, and I will touch on that in a second, and you put them into an arena where you use cover and you use depending on distance and angle and what cover they're in, you can attack enemies. In most respects, it's pretty similar to your XCOM, or I've been meaning to actually play Jagged Alliance. I do want to give that a try eventually, but there are a few other games where turn-based combat was a basic thing. And it works. It's functional. It's not necessarily as fluid as a lot of other turn-based action games. I mean, I'm comparing this to XCOM Enemy Within, the full expansion from the most recent XCOM, not the most recent XCOM game, but the big remake that happened with Firaxis. And I would probably argue that XCOM is probably a little bit more fluid to play, but has too many inbuilt issues with its system that Hard West manages to address. And I think if Hard West had been able to improve and polish the system it had, make it more fluid, make it feel more dynamic, but keep the changes it had made, it would have been better than XCOM's combat, without a shadow of a doubt. So the big changes, I'd say, like, the one thing that is notably missing if you went from XCOM to Hard West is Hard West lacks a Overwatch option, which is slightly frustrating because the enemies have it inbuilt. Essentially what can happen is if you are standing next to a doorway and an enemy runs directly by you, nothing happens. You have no way of setting your guy up to go, if this guy comes through the doorway, I pull the trigger and blow his head off. It's not an option. However, if you go through a doorway and you run right past an enemy and you go through their cone of fire, they point blank you, which the first couple of times it happened, it felt like a bit of a bullshit mechanic. It gave the enemy a kind of caveat for them to get away with it, whereas you had to work to a slightly different set of rules. However, the main idea I think was behind it was trying to force people to think more dynamically about how they use their weaponry. Because shotguns, for most people, especially in video games, are a run right into some dude's grill, blow it the fuck off. Whereas in Hard West, the focus is a little bit more on maneuver around, corral enemies together, and then utilise its spread to try and whittle down people. And whittling down is probably the big change that Hard West made for the better, and I might as well talk about it now. The big improvement that Hard West made over XCOM, and I think over most turn-based strategy games, has been the concept of luck, where essentially, no matter what you're doing, as long as you are firing at an enemy, you are making an impact on the combat. It doesn't necessarily matter if you had 2% to hit, you still take a little bit of their luck away. Luck is essentially I keep using essentially, by the way, I apologise for that, but fuck you. Luck is a stat that doubles as your skill point pool, so you can use abilities via luck, but it also affects as like a shield. The higher your luck, the more likely you are to avoid incoming shots. Now, this may seem a bit bullshit because it essentially gives certain enemies instant plot armor. You'll never take them out in the first shot, but you can. The idea behind it is it always gives your character something to do in the middle of combat. Even if you don't have a particularly high chance of shooting at someone, you're making it easier for another player to also shoot the enemy. So again, like later on in my Let's Play, I was using my less accurate shots to whittle an enemy's luck down, then get the big gun out because I was almost guaranteed to hit with it and I knew I could use it strategically. So if anything, I'd argue there's a little bit more strategy involved. Not maybe gaming the system, but really taking advantage of the mechanics of the system, whereas in things like XCOM, you just have to sort of unload at something and pray one of the friggin' dice values says, yes, you hit it, otherwise you could waste an entire turn's worth of combat achieving diddly shit, which I think is kind of unfair. Now, having that as like a dual resource pool is a bit of a gamble. May not be everyone's cup of tea because it does make it difficult to utilise a lot of the abilities you gain. But at the same time, it's more focusing on you strategically putting these characters together. So a lot of the time, these kind of characters are very much useful for buffing and improving general statistics. Sometimes it's for actual tangible actions, and there's no sense in just cludging a bunch of cards together for like one small tangential bonus. It's much smarter to go, right, who's probably not going to be using their luck much? Who's not going to get shot at a lot and therefore have their luck reduced? You have that person have the powerful skill where they can run in, dump it, and then run away again, and you've used that ability. where, say that in comparison to say XCOM, where everyone's got abilities, the usefulness of them is pretty much only dependent on where they are at the time and whether or not you've fucked up in some other way. So there's a lot more uncertainty with the use of those skills. Whereas with Hard West, if you plan accordingly, 90% of the time your skills will come off and they will actually help. You just have to be prepared. So a lot of the time I'd run into places and run out of luck purely because I just hadn't structured my characters correctly. And I went back and watched and I was like, oh, I done stupid shit there. I really could have used X, Y, or Z as a skill. And especially near the end in Scars of Freedom, I was using bank shots far more effectively because I was working out, okay, all I need to do is ensure that someone's luck is low enough and then put myself in the right position and I can hit anyone on the fucking map. Beautiful, beautiful skill. So I would argue that is a fantastic change, and I really hope more games take this on board, because just giving everyone something productive to do in a round of combat makes a huge difference to the level of engagement you have with the game overall. You never feel like you've wasted time playing it. So that's well worth looking into. Outside of that, the character building aspect, as I touched on just a second ago, it is pretty much standard. You have certain cards in Scars of Freedom. They slightly twist it, where you have to buy certain things and they pair differently. But the overall idea is you build a hand of cards, each card has its own ability, and then they are also structured like a poker hand. So you don't just have to think about what cards synergize together in terms of their effects, but what cards synergize well in their suit or number. So you can build a full house and get additional benefits over how the cards all synergize themselves, which I think is a nice idea. So if you've got a bunch of junk cards which don't really do much together, they'll still work as maybe like a 2-pair or a 3 of a kind, which I think is nice. Gives the player more flexibility. Outside of that, yes, Scars of Freedom, I think did this kind of, I like the idea they had, I just think they implemented it a bit too late in the game. The idea with Scars of Freedom was you didn't just discover your cards and have them as part of encounters. You had to discover them, then go and buy them with a finite resource you were also using for other things. Now, that would work better in a long-term campaign where you can do side missions, do radiant missions, get ether, build up your kind of gear, and then outfit people properly. Because throughout the entirety of that game, I never once made a actual full recipe for someone. Like, you had to know precisely what items you needed, where you could get them, and have a budget for the ether in order to make it. And even then, you could only have one. Now, I feel like that may have just been like someone in development went, well, I can do it, so clearly these other players can do it. But sorry, mate, I would have liked it if that had maybe come off a little bit earlier. I'd had the opportunity to do it a bit earlier, especially since especially since I don't think it was possible for me to do it until like the second to last combat mission, which renders the whole thing moot when you're getting these recipes really early on and you can't implement them. So yeah, if I was going to make any kind of black mark against any of this game at all, I would say the DLC, Scars of Freedom, it does tease you with what could be really cool shit that you can't really use maybe until like your second playthrough, when you know where certain things are, you've worked out how to do it, and then you go and implement it. But by that point, you're pretty much only doing it so you can do like the Iron Man hardcore run, and you're probably not that rich in terms of ether anyway. But anyway, outside of that, the rest of the mechanics of the gameplay were fairly straightforward. It was interesting the way they implemented the choose your own adventure playstyle as well. I thought that was a very unusual choice, but I suppose at the end of the day it does allow you to tell the story a bit more effectively. What happened was you could pick where you could go on a map, and then each map would have a certain event, and the way you reacted to that event, what items you had, what skills you had, who was with you, could impact how that unfolded. And I've gone through other games where it may be a little bit more freeform than that, or it may even be a little bit more limited than that, but it seemed to work quite nicely in the context of the game. It felt a lot more like a tabletop role-playing game, which is kind of interesting, because I've heard a lot of people going, oh, I like this idea for a game, but it really should be a tabletop. Mate, there is a system called Deadlands. You want to play that, that's what you play. Although if Hard West want to like fund their own tabletop game, or like an expansion for Deadlands, fucking go for it, mate, that'd be brilliant. So yeah, that's pretty much my my thoughts in a nutshell. The game is perfectly adequate at most things, very enjoyable in the areas where it succeeds, and actually has some interesting stuff to bring to the table in regards to how you utilise certain gameplay mechanics in games. I really hope more games take the luck system on board, because it's such a nice idea. Oh, and also the tiered cover system as well, where cover doesn't necessarily just mean your chance of being able to hit, but when you are hitting cover, it absorbs damage, which I thought was very nice, because it meant that you always had a benefit of being in cover, even if you weren't necessarily going to avoid getting shot. Just any hit rounds hitting you were still going to be less damage. So you knew if someone was like 2 hits away from dying, if you put them in full cover, they weren't going to get taken out on their next round, provided someone didn't have some ludicrously high penetration rifle. And again, like the whole idea of penetrating through cover, the idea of banking shots, flanking, it felt like a much more tactical choice, whereas in other squad-based games, it feels a lot more like you just have to hunker down, aim at a motherfucker, and pray you hit them, which I think is a little bit unfair at the end of the day. So, yes, for people who haven't got Hard West and maybe aren't a fan of tactical turn-based shooting, it may be worth a try while picking this up on sale. This is probably a nice, easy introduction to the system. Not too complex, but is probably a bit more balanced and a bit more easy to pick up than other games out there. It's not got the most polish on it, it's not the highest produced, but at the same time, it's easy to pick up, easy to let go, and it's nice, and its segmented story system means you don't feel like you've got to slog your way through a huge amount of content to get anywhere. Even if you just do one campaign, give it a couple of weeks, come back and do a second campaign, you're always getting stuff, and you're unlocking stuff for later campaigns as well. You're unlocking extra gear, which I think is a really nice touch as well. If you are a big fan of this, it may feel a little bit limited. It may not feel quite as comprehensive and like full-on as other turn-based shooter games, but it is probably worth looking into if you do genuinely enjoy the genre, because it does what it does very well, and it is very enjoyable for it. Other than that, yeah, I would recommend this game. I had a huge amount of fun playing with it. I don't really feel the urge to go back and replay it, but then again, I'd never really feel that urge with most games unless they have like multiple play styles or like completely different endings. So I'm not necessarily going to have a bit of an issue with that. However, yeah, I don't do numerical reviews in this anyway, but I very much enjoyed this, and I hope that Creative Forge Games, brain did not go there for a second, kind of harness this and go further. If they want to make more DLC for Hard West, brilliant. I would not mind seeing a little bit more. If they want to go forward and do something else, or use this general engine in something more advanced and expand it more, that would also be fantastic. I mean, if you guys want to do like niche genre fiction, Cyberpunk would be fucking amazing. I mean, possibly not like oh god damn it! All right, I can never. Shadowrun? Yes, Shadowrun. Maybe not quite like Shadowrun, but something in that vein with turn-based combat, cyberpunk, that kind of thing. Because you guys seem like you've got a really nice grasp on how to build something that works and is fair and fun to play over something that is polished and glossy, but kind of inherently lopsided. So kudos to you for that. So I will now shut up now. It's been about 25 minutes, and I have rambled on for far long enough. So thank you very much for watching, and I apologise it's taken me this long to do a review. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.